Okay, so let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of the Nonzero podcast. You guys, as you know, are Danny Bessner and Derek Davison of the American Prestige podcast. And this is an episode of both podcasts. We've decided we're going to get together every couple of months, if not more frequently, talk about foreign affairs. To further complicate things, this is a hybrid edition of this dual podcast because we taped a conversation late last week, but before we got it posted, Hamas attacked Israel, and we decided that was a sufficiently seismic event that it would be kind of strange to make no mention of it on a foreign affairs podcast posted now. So we're reassembling. That conversation is at the back end of this. That's still there. If people stay with us long enough. But now we're going to talk about Israel-Palestine. Is there anything I left out that you guys want to throw in?
I don't think so.
That sounds about right.
Covered it. Yeah.
Okay. And you guys have covered it, I guess, pretty thoroughly. There are other things on your podcast feed, on the American Prestige podcast feed about this, including, I gather, an interview with Rashid Khalidi of Columbia.
Yes, that we just recorded that, so that should be out, I think, by the time this this comes up.
So check that out, please. Please.
So I don't know. I don't know how to even what to say first. Obviously, it's horrible on a number of levels, and may get more so. I don't know. I have other things to say, but I'll give you a chance. Yeah.
Well, I'm just curious, how have people been reacting in your orbits of establishmentarian journalists? Just kidding.
I think you missed the part of my career where I was expelled from that.
But in all seriousness, how have you noticed people responding in sort of the
I mean, on my Twitter feed, I have I follow a diversity of people. I guess the frustration for me always with these kinds of things is that naturally, understandably, there's a lot of emotion on both sides. And there isn't sometimes much tolerance for an attempt to do kind of a more detached clinical assessment of what's going on. And if you sometimes if you try to do one, you get accused of siding with one side. I mean, like with Ukraine, it was like if you point to NATO expansion and you think that may have played a causal role in making invasion more likely, then you have to immediately add, I condemn the invasion, I'm against invasions. And this is kind of a similar thing. And of course, I obviously do condemn, massacres at music festivals, which is one thing that happened here. But I would still like to talk about root causes of this, how it happened, what we might learn, make it less likely to happen in the future and stuff like that. I don't know. That's my...
Well, it just seems like the entire North Atlantic world is lining up behind Israel, and this is going to encourage Israel, particularly the Netanyahu government, to take even more extreme measures. I mean, this is the thing. Like, I feel like the American discourse is still, and tell me if I'm wrong, I might be wrong, is still like steeped in this like 1990s moment, even as people have accepted that the two-state solution is basically a non-starter. There's like, if we just talk it out and get something to go, but in actuality, when the empire lines up behind you, and in this case, it's really lining up behind Israel, it'll just encourage Israel to do whatever the hell it wants, frankly. And what it wants to do is nothing good from a perspective of international law or humanitarian concern. So it just seems to me like that's the actual reality, is that it's encouraging ethnic cleansing, perhaps. And that's where the discussion should start.
I don't think you have to condone what happened or
no, of course
condemn
not.
it.
I don't condone murdering.
To just say no. But I mean, this is. I'm not talking about you, Danny. This is the question that you're the demand. Do you condone or condemn whatever happened? And I'm saying, unless you've lived, a week in Gaza under the current circumstances, under the way that things have been for the last 17 years. I don't think you need to have an opinion on that to acknowledge that when you bottle people up in a place like this, you bar the doors, you don't let them leave to get medical treatment, you give them 4 hours of electricity a day, you give them barely any clean water. I know the Israelis have said they've now cut water off. That's a cruel joke. I mean, they didn't have water and electricity to begin with, except in the barest sense. You don't have to have an opinion on what happened to acknowledge that this is the kind of thing that results from that. You cannot keep people in conditions like this in perpetuity. And this is one of the things that I think is going to be one of the biggest repercussions of what's happened is the Israeli government has spent years, decades, you could argue, at least a couple of decades, trying to make the occupation as painless for the Israeli public as possible, to create a situation where the occupation is just kind of out of sight, out of mind. It's managed. We don't have to worry about it. We don't have to worry about keeping these people in inhumane conditions, in apartheid conditions. We can just do as we like. Don't you worry your pretty little heads about it. We got it under control. And maybe that's been punctured now by what's happened. And again, I'm not condoning what's happened, but I don't think it's condoning it to say this is it. This is the inevitable result of what has been going on for really 56 years at this point. But certainly, if we talk specifically about Gaza, since the blockade was imposed in 2006, 2007. So I that's where I'm at on that particular issue.
Yeah, I think it's predictable that when you keep people under occupation, there will be violent uprisings. It usually happens. I mean, strictly speaking, of course, Gaza isn't under occupation in the sense that the West Bank is, but this economic blockade, makes it feel a lot like an occupation. I mean, especially given the fact that periodically there are these conflicts. So every once in a while, a bunch of people in Gaza get killed, and usually, and this is what really kind of worries, a number of things worry me right now. But traditionally, it seems like when there is a conflict breaks out with Gaza, the ratio of killed Palestinians to killed Israelis is what, 5-1, 10-1, and I gather that Israel kind of wants to send that message, and now in this case, that would imply thousands and thousands of Palestinians yet to be killed. But I mean, this is a good example of something you can get screamed at for saying right now. Of course, is that that it's just a predictable thing that if you don't solve a problem like this of people living under occupation and being deprived of basic rights and basic things you need in life, things like this are going to happen. That doesn't mean you can't condemn them. In fact, I would also, separate from the horror of imagining a bunch of people at a music concert being killed, there's kind of the tactical question of like, does Hamas understand that they'd probably be better off if they had focused at least to somewhat a greater extent on military targets and not,
I think it's just a last-ditch effort. Like, to me, this is a desperate move. It is like an all-out desperate move. The strategic objectives that one could devise just seem impossible to achieve. And I wanted to ask Bob, who is doing the screaming? Like I mean, just like American mainstream people.
Well, yeah, I mean, I follow a bunch of people on Twitter who would scream at you for this. I have the only thing I've done on Twitter. So the defense minister, Gallant, and he's not even one of the two craziest guys in the Israeli cabinet, right? There's Ben Gvir, and then there's the other guy, one of whom had a portrait of Baruch.
Smotrich, the finance minister.
Yeah, one of whom was a Baruch Goldstein fan.
That's Ben Gvir, I think. Maybe both of them, but Ben Gvir was definitely
he had like a portrait of Goldstein up in it, and of course Goldstein massacred 22 Palestinians. So I mean, one thing that establishes is like, this talk of they're animals. There are people behaving like animals on both sides. But that speaks to this thing. So there's this quote from not one of the two craziest guys in the Israeli cabinet, the defense minister. He says, "I've ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed." Derek, you might say things were already almost that bad. But anyway, he says, "We are fighting human animals and we act accordingly." So I quote tweeted and said, so he's saying Israel will treat all 2 million residents of Gaza like animals, even leaving aside international law, morality, etc. It's not in Israel's long-term security interest to think this way or talk this way. And that, that you can say that. No, you're not going to get screamed at if you frame it kind of, I think, carefully. And that got some traction. But, I mean, there's some, as you know, there's some very animated things being said on both sides.
I mean, it's just,
I would.
Derek, you go.
Well, to respond, Bob, to what you said earlier, there's one thing we should be clear about is that they did attack military targets. They attacked the Erez checkpoint, which is the bottleneck that the Israeli military uses to keep people out of Israel, and in fact was closed for several weeks last month. Which led to a great deal of unrest and violence as a result, because that's one of the few economic lifelines for people in Gaza is to go through Erez and work in Israel. What I would say, to the music festival, obviously attacking people at a music festival is a horrific act, and it's condemnable. The fact that there was a music festival being held within just a very short distance from the world's largest open air prison camp is, I think, part of what I was saying earlier, the notion that this has been carefully curated for many years now to be the occupation, I mean, to be something that people don't think about anymore. And so it's not weird, I guess, to have a music festival and celebrate that close to a place where horrifying things are happening on a daily basis. It's just such a strange, and I'm absolutely not saying that justifies attacking people at a music festival. I just think it speaks to the whole just difficulty of this entire situation and the way that it's been kind of shunted aside while you have people living under deplorable conditions every day, and that tension building and building and building, and nobody seeming to really give that much thought until something like this happens.
This is the tension of colonialism going back to the beginning of colonialism. And it just seems odd in the 21st century because most of the basically colonial projects have been completed successfully in favor of the colonizers, if we're talking about, the Western Hemisphere, and in favor of national liberation movements, if we're talking about the global South. It's almost like an atavistic conflict. So also people don't even have the framework to understand this colonial project because it's an unfinished project. And I think that's what the defense minister was essentially saying, that this is a colonial project that he's going to try to complete to some regard. It seems very actually interesting if you study, and not interesting, very explicable and not very complicated if you know anything about the history of 20th century colonialism and decolonization. It's just most people don't know or appreciate that history in 2023.
Yeah, you were mentioning that. I guess it was you, Danny, called it an act of desperation. There are people saying that there are other things behind, that it was more calculated than you might think, and that part of the idea is to disrupt this effort to consolidate ties or establish ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel. This thing that started as the Abraham Accords and now
they already have ties. I just don't buy that at all.
I'll tell you though. But I'd like to, and of course the Wall Street Journal did this piece saying Iran helped plan this. That has been, I don't know what the status of that report is. I'm agnostic for now. Certainly
debunked.
Israel and America are saying they have no evidence.
Yeah, Israel, the Israeli
Ye-
government says they don't have any evidence. The
Yeah,
US says, I mean,
we
it
might.
could come out. It's no evidence yet, certainly. I mean, they're not saying
Okay,
this is not
but
true, but
I
you know.
would say a couple of things. First of all, that would make sense from both Iran's and Hamas's point of view, because part of the Biden plan with Saudi Arabia is they give a lot of money to the Palestinian Authority, which is, of course, Hamas's rival for influence among the Palestinian people. So they would be happy to disrupt it. Iran certainly would, and the reason I want to talk about this is because it's a good example of the way U.S. policy proceeds without anyone stopping and asking, wait a second, how is this going to be viewed by these various actors? Might one of them find it very threatening and do something? Almost reminds me of NATO expansion in Ukraine, right? Like not putting yourself in Russia's shoes and ask, like, what are their national security interests? And let me just finish on the Iran point. You got to remember, from Iran's point of view, okay, this deal, I mean, the way it's being described as, well, we would establish a counterbalance to Iran by drawing Saudi Arabia into the U.S. Israeli camp. Well, Iran's not going to look at it as some benign counterbalance. They're going to look at it as a profound threat, because part of the deal would be a security commitment of the U.S. to join Saudi Arabia in a war with, for example, Iran. This is very threatening to Iran. Did anybody talk about that? I didn't even think about it clearly, but obviously before you do a policy like this, you should ask, is this going to be thought of as a sufficiently grave threat for someone to try to cause a lot of trouble to derail it? Now, I don't know if Iran helped plan it. I would guess they were at least given a heads up. But who knows? But the point is, it is another example of heedless U.S. policy, it seems to me.
So two quick things. I don't think the U.S. gives a shit about the Middle East, and really hasn't for a while. So I don't think there's the best and the brightest aren't really thinking about this. I think they want to basically disengage from the region in general. And what do you think this suggests about how the U.S. cares about the Palestinian issue? Does it care at all? I mean, I think the answer to these questions is very clear. And once those two basically structuring principles are taken into account, this all becomes very clear. They don't really care about the Middle East anymore. That's just the truth. They would like to have some engagement with Saudi Arabia. They would like Europe to continue to get oil from the region, but they don't really care that much. And I think certainly the entire history of the last 30, 40 years suggests that the U.S., that its officials don't really care about the Palestinian problem. Probably at some level, they want it to be, quote unquote, solved. So from that perspective, this all becomes very clear to me.
Yeah, I think U.S. policymakers don't care about the Palestinians. I do think they continue to care about the Middle East. A security commitment to Saudi Arabia is a huge thing. And also, but American politics compel them to care, right? I mean, the Israel lobby makes it an important issue to American politicians. That's
it makes support of Israel by giving them money and weapons important to American. That's pretty much it. That to me is the foundation of it right now. U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. It's like ensure Israel is extremely strong. That's the policy, and kind of anything that flows from that is secondary or tertiary. In my read of the strategic calculus, basically the way I would put it, like the State Department Arabists, who were pretty influential at points during the Cold War, have no influence any longer and probably don't really exist. And so you have this. Everything flows from that, as I see it. I don't know, Derek, if you disagree.
I mean, they're doing foreign policy on behalf of the Israeli government. That's what the Abraham Accords were. That's what this deal with Saudi Arabia will be, especially because, I mean, the Abraham Accords were relatively cheap. The U.S. had to, recognize Morocco's claim on Western Sahara. It had to sell agree to sell F-35s, which I still don't think we've actually done to the UAE. So that was relatively cheap, but we still bought those normalization deals. This agreement that's on the table with Saudi Arabia, which is a blanket defense pact, standing up a Saudi nuclear program that includes uranium enrichment, which is a proliferation risk. That's like really giving a king's ransom, essentially, to the Saudis to buy their friendship with Israel. So, I mean, I think that there's still a pull here, and I don't know how you define what that pull is. If it's the desire for stable oil prices, if it's the impetus to race to Israel's aggrandizement at every possible turn. There's a lot of things going on there. Bob, to your point, I do think that geopolitics matter here to some extent. I've seen people say, Hamas isn't worried about some deal with the guy, and I think that belittles Hamas to some extent. It treats them as this kind of these provincial backwater hicks who don't really know what's going on in the world or whatever, care. I don't think that's true. Certainly, I think that you look at this from a Palestinian perspective. This is another piece of whatever little leverage the Palestinians had to negotiate a state going away, disappearing, being taken by the U.S. and Israel and the Saudis. Which that piece being the idea of Israeli normalization with the Arab states coming after the creation of a Palestinian state. Mm-hmm. I don't know how you weigh that against 17 years of brutality and deprivation in Gaza. I don't know how you weigh it against the ongoing deprivations of the occupation for over 50 years with a government in power right now that has made it its mission to do what is essentially a slow-rolling annexation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, diverting resources. That people ask, well, how did this happen? How did they miss the intelligence? How did they why was the response so slow? They have diverted military resources away from Gaza to defend settler mobs that descend on Palestinian villages in the West Bank and burn homes and kill people. This is the priority for this government. You mentioned Ben Gvir and Smotrich. This is their priority, and they've been given, Netanyahu has given them by and large, control over this, over the occupation, and they dictate policy. And what they want is to take over the West Bank. They want to take control of Al-Aqsa and that site, the Temple Mount or Al-Aqsa in East Jerusalem. This is their priority, and that cannot be ignored. If you talk about the Saudi issue, that's probably there at some level, but I think any analysis of why this happened and why it happened now has to start with the occupation, and in particular, if you want to get really immediate about it, has to start with what this particular Israeli government has been doing for 10 months now or whatever it's been.
Oh, sure. I mean, that's the driving energy at some level. But I think if you ask, why now, why so big, why so elaborate and so on, I think it's quite possible that the Saudi thing figures. And I'll say one more thing about that. China, not so long ago, orchestrated a kind of incipient rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That was big and potentially very constructive. And one thing the Biden administration is doing with its plan is dismantling that. Okay, there's tension between the Biden plan and Abraham Accords on the one hand, and trying to establish rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran on the other. And that is the big rift in the region. That is the place where war, devastating, horrible, regional, even world war could break out between, on the one hand, kind of Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, so on, and if the Arabs are lining up with the U.S. and Israel, with all of that. And it's just, we threw that away. It wouldn't surprise me if that was part of the motivation of the Biden peace plan, because the Biden peace plan really, I didn't hear about it until after China did this, right? And it's as if Biden is like, oh, you think you can be the big player in this region and bring peace? No, we'll show you. We'll step in and fuck everything up the way we always do. And the other thing it illustrates, I think, did we just lose Danny? He seems to be making a heartfelt effort to return. But the other thing it illustrates is, I don't think China was apparently perceived as kind of an honest broker by both sides. The U.S. just can't do that. It can't do it between Iran, Saudi Arabia. It can't do it between Israel and the Palestinians. And I mean, it's just not politically able, I think, to do it. And I guess, Danny, you said finally people are realizing the two-state solution is a non-starter. Well, the people you hang out with are, but the official establishment line, parroted by all kinds of elite journalists and think tankers, is we have to get back to the two-state solution. Whereas that's not going to happen.
Could I just suggest something? So, like, there are points, if you study the history of U.S. foreign policy, when there's just like strategic dyscalculus in a region where something is just not that important for the state for a variety of reasons, and there's just not a lot of thought put into it. To me, that is basically U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East for the last 6-7 years. I don't think it's an area of strategic concern. I don't think they really care, again, beyond making sure Israel is powerful. And this is why you see a lot of, like, if you if you look at this rationally, it doesn't make much sense. But I think if you look at it from the perspective of a complicated state that has interests and invests resources and invests time and effort, it's pretty clear the U.S. doesn't really care that much about the Middle East any longer. And it wants to make a strategic pivot to great power competition for a bunch of different reasons. And I think this is just an era of strategic dyscalculus in the region.
But the one thing you mentioned, that you acknowledge, that the U.S. wants to remain on the side of Israel, is very consequential. I mean, why do you think Trump? Why do you think Trump assassinated Soleimani and almost started a war?
Well, I think why he did that. I don't think there was a strategic calculus. I think that morning,
not from that morning,
he got a report and he said we could kill this guy. And he goes, "Who's this guy?" And he said he's an evil guy from Iran who was head of the Quds Force. And Trump said, "Kill him." I think that's literally as far as the strategic calculus.
Well, why wasn't he killing some guy in Taiwan or I mean, but why that guy?
I think, Bob, you're looking for rationality where there is none.
No, I'll give you some. I'll give you some. Do you think that Trump at no point thought, Sheldon Adelson might not mind this? Sheldon Adelson was this massive donor who has literally advocated dropping a nuclear bomb in the Iranian desert, quote, just to show them what we have.
Well, I mean, maybe one of the advisors.
Not just Adelson, though. It's not just the Adelson and the Israel folks. With Soleimani, I'm sure that Trump had his Saudi pals in his ear saying this is a bad guy, he should be taken out. I'm sure that Jared Kushner was in his ear because Jared Kushner had apparently, as it turns out, 2 billion reasons to want to do whatever the Saudis.
So corrupt. This country is so done.
And so I'm sure he had Kushner in his ear saying, "Hey, Pops, let's knock this guy out."
No, the Saudi, and there's more and more money from the Gulf influencing U.S. policy. That's all true. It's just that the one thing Danny acknowledged is that we care about Israel, and I'm saying that alone is a powerful thing.
Yeah, it shapes the entire thing.
Because, for example, China does this potentially constructive thing, and we just can't live with that, right? We cared enough to do this crazy Biden initiative.
I mean, we care about the great power aspect of it too. We care about China looking like the peacemaker, doing the things that we're supposed to do. That's the United States job. We're the boss of the world. We're supposed to define the security agenda for everybody.
Yeah, there's
but Bob, I think
here as well.
To go back to your point about the two-state solution, this to me, for most of the people, I don't want to say all, but for most of the people who still harp on the two-state solution because they haven't looked at a map in 20 years or they haven't checked back in on what's actually going on in the region, it is an indication that people just don't care about this issue. It's that's the muscle memory, the two-state solution, two-state solution, two-state solution. And they look at it in a superficial way. You have two peoples, there have to be two states. That's it. And that's all the thought that goes into it. So I do think that's to some extent evidence of just a lack of interest or concern in Israel-Palestine.
Yeah, and foreign affairs generally. I mean, Americans, like many people probably in many countries, don't care that much about foreign policy unless, suddenly Americans are getting killed in large numbers. So, yeah, for most people, it's two-state solution seems to make sense. It does in principle. I could imagine a version of it that would be better than what we got. It's just that that's not going to happen. And we've gotten to a point where it can't happen. But look, I want to emphasize, I agree that Cold War competition with China is one thing driving Biden's policy in the Middle East. The influence of Persian Gulf states is as well. And then there's Israel. My point is, as a practical matter, we are very engaged in the Middle East, and we're going to stay that way. Because those three considerations tend to align and point to the same set of like Biden policies and push us in the same direction. So anyway, I don't know. It's depressing.
It's very depressing.
It's extraordinarily depressing.
Yeah, it's going to be. I think what Israel's response is going to be truly terrible. I see that forthcoming.
Well, that's why. I mean, again, as a tactical matter, and look, I understand resistance movements get in the habit of killing civilians because violent resistance movements, which again, right or wrong, tend to spring up in situations like this. They get in the habit of killing civilians because that's often the only thing available to them. They just don't have the power to take on the military in a significant way. It's just at this time, somehow, through a combination of planning and resources, they actually did mount a serious challenge and to a number of military bases. But I don't know what's going to happen. Do you guys think it could go a lot wider? I mean, and even there's no obvious interaction with the Ukraine war, to my mind, but maybe I'm missing something. I hope there's no kind of synergy between them.
I don't think so. I mean, the Russian response has been shaded, I think, toward the Palestinians. That's probably an artifact of Ukraine because Russia's orientation has gone away from the West and toward, countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So they've been a little less supportive of Israel than I think you could have expected in prior to that conflict. I mean, in terms of expansion, the obvious thing to watch for is the Lebanese Israeli border and whether Hezbollah is going to get involved on some level. There was an infiltration just today by, I think, Islamic Jihad fighters that the Israelis say they stopped. And there've been exchanges of fire across the border, artillery, and now I think some helicopter strikes by the Israelis on southern Lebanon. So that's certainly something to watch. Hezbollah is constrained to some extent, I think, by Lebanese politics. It's constrained by the fact that it's spread a little bit thin, given that it's still operating in Syria. So I don't know that there's I don't know that the chances of them seriously getting involved in a major way are all that high. But that's where I would look first if you're talking about could this metastasize.
Yeah, it looks like so far Lebanon is focusing their fire on Shaba Farms, which is a small area where they have a territorial claim. And I would think if they can confine it to that, that would be good news in effect.
I mean, it's if it remains this sort of like occasional artillery barrage back and forth, I think that's one thing. It's another if it turns into a ground war or something.
So, can anything good come of this even in the long run? I mean, yeah, because in terms of American political awareness, I mean, you've got Ilhan Omar tweeting that she stands with the Israeli people, and that's kind of all she says so far, at least, right? So it doesn't seem like the kind of awareness of the plight of the Palestinians that you might like to see is spreading like wildfire in America right now.
But Bob, maybe we could actually end on this question. So, like, I think a major theme of our discussions is going to be international law. So, when are you going to give up on international law, Bob?
Never. It's the only.
What do you think this suggests about it, or is there anything we can learn about that, or is this just the usual? It doesn't matter if you're the hegemon or have the hegemon behind you, and the United States decides the state of exception, and Israel's in the state of exception, and that's that.
I worry increasingly. My view is there was a golden moment right after the Cold War when the U.S. had huge normative power. Probably had the power to like really establish the norm of complying with the international law, at least the one against transborder aggression. And it even worked out for a few years during the first Bush administration. But then we ourselves started violating that law more than once, and everything fell apart, including U.S.-Russia relations. I thought there was a chance When will a chance come again? What worries me is that it will take another conflagration. I mean, when you look at it, like World War I led to the League of Nations, highly imperfect thing, but a catastrophe of that magnitude did lead to an interesting experiment. World War II led to the UN, highly imperfect, but better than the League of Nations. Again, huge catastrophe leads to a serious rethink about, international institutions and international law. I worry that, it's going to take another catastrophe before people realize that it would actually be in America's interests and the interest of the other powers to establish rules of the road that everyone abides by. The powerful nations that have the power to help establish these norms of respecting the laws, unfortunately, are the ones that can get away with not respecting the law. And it's tempting to do that in the short run, and I think stupid in the long run. But as go ahead.
No, sorry, Bob. I mean, I don't want to be end on totally downer note, and I think if you want to try to find something to hope for, it comes in something I talked about earlier, which is this years-long effort to push the occupation out of the consciousness of really anybody, policymakers in the West, anybody around the world watching, but most particularly out of the minds of the Israeli public, and to say that this is being managed and we don't ever have to resolve it. We can keep it going like this forever, and that maybe that can't be sustained anymore. Maybe that myth has been done away with permanently. In which case, something will have to change. Whether that change goes in it's going to be a very negative direction, certainly in the short run. I don't know what it'll be in the long run, but that's the thing to hope for, that it'll eventually, that somewhere down the line, this will lead to positive change in that particular space.
So,
I hope so. I mean, yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry. No, you go. No,
I just going to say it's again, I mean, catastrophes can lead to fundamental rethinks. And maybe this one will, on a regional level, a rethink of Israel-Palestine. Not that there's super easy solutions at this point, but, sad thing is the catastrophe has not nearly unfolded completely. I mean, I just think we're going to see thousands and thousands killed in Gaza, including more Israelis, because I think they're going in on the ground, and it's not going to be good. What were you going to say, Danny?
I was going to say we should end by singing the Internationale.
As you know, I'm a neoliberal shill, so I'm afraid.
What would that be? The Chilean national anthem? What do neoliberal shills sing?
That's a good question. We need a good anthem. We promised to come up with one by the next episode, folks, of Nonzero meets American Prestige. But there is more to come on this episode. There's another conversation that's about to unfold after we sign off.
So you're welcome.
Double the episode, I guess.
Yeah. We are we're nothing if not generous. Wouldn't we all three agree that that's true of us?
Oh, absolutely.
I definitely feel like I'm a generous person. Absolutely.
I feel that you are too, Danny. I'm on the fence about.
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay. So thanks. And again, there's more to come on this conversation, and then the three of us will be back in some undetermined number of
in a couple of months.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Yep. Thanks to everybody for listening. See you around.
Hello,
hey, Bob.
How you guys doing?
Danny, I see you all the time. So
yeah. So what is this we're doing? We know one thing we can say for sure, it's not the last time we're going to do it, right? Well, this is going to be the three of us are going to do this.
Well, I mean, let's see how it goes. But
if it dissolves into bitter acrimony, we won't do it again. But we're thinking about doing it again in a couple of months, and then a couple of months after that, and a couple of months after that, and so
regular
make it a regular
updates.
thing.
See what we're
Why
all
not?
up to. Catch up with some old friends, talk about foreign policy, talk about what's going on.
Yeah,
in
like
the
normal
world.
people do. Normal people sit around and talk about foreign
We're just going to be
policy.
like
Right.
normal people.
right,
Classic normal people behavior.
Very normal.
Especially
Right.
as we're heating up into it's like the Super Bowl now. We're entering the
Right.
presidential election space. So there'll be a lot to talk about, both politically and in terms of U.S. foreign policy, and
Right.
we should do about Taiwan and all those good things.
Okay. So this is so I have a podcast called the Nonzero Podcast associated with my Nonzero newsletter. You guys have a podcast called American Prestige, which has a corresponding Substack, and this is a product of both, right? This is like a joint endeavor. It'll appear on both.
Right.
It's what they call in Hollywood. We're doing a co-pro.
It's a crossover.
Co-production. Crossover.
Yeah.
It's like when the X-Men fought the Fantastic Four.
Or, as my generation would put it, when people from Green Acres showed up on Petticoat Junction.
Oh,
that's what I was thinking. That's where I was going.
Right. Yeah. You watched that when you were 1 year old or something? Not even.
Not even.
No, that was. I think that was even behind the times for syndication. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about foreign policy, and I think the chemistry will be good. We know each other. We've talked before. You guys we're all skeptics of American foreign policy, I think, to put it mildly. You guys are probably to my left. I mean, especially Danny, who within 5 minutes will giving me a lecture on Marxist doctrine, I'm sure, as typically happens in our conversations.
Again, a very normal thing for people to do when they hang
this
out.
is just what normal people do.
Totally. It's like, it's like Taylor Swift, Super Bowl, base and superstructure, dialectical materialism, the usual American conversation. I don't know where to begin. There's so much disenchantment among us with American foreign policy.
Well, Bob, I actually had a question for you that I was thinking about yesterday. And maybe we could start here, because I think it relates to, just sort of a meta question, which is, how do you've been a critic of U.S. foreign policy for so long, and how do you do it without becoming just incredibly black-pilled and disenchanted?
It's actually a struggle. You have those moments when you're under a lot of stress from other sources, and you tune in to Twitter, and you see a Michael McFaul tweet or something. And it's just I'm living in crazy land. This is it's funny. I taped a few days ago and posted yesterday a conversation with Lyle Goldstein. You probably know who he is, right?
I listened to the conversation. It was really good. Everyone check it out.
And it's on the one hand, it's radically different from what you're generally getting about what a war with China over Taiwan would be like. On the other hand, it's just common sense. He's just let's do the math. Let's look at the incentives. And this guy's a total expert on this stuff, 20 years at the Naval War College. And this is sanity. This is common sense. But it's totally unlike what you hear, anywhere, MSNBC, CNN, mainstream, whatever, right? So it's hard. That's why we turn to each other for therapeutic support.
Because it's funny, because I think about it, and there's only so many times I could write the same article, which is the same thing keeps happening. We have Iraq, and then there's another intervention. Everyone gets behind that intervention. That intervention goes bad, and that we'll never do another intervention. Then there's another intervention, and it's the entire thing happening again. And it's just the sort of disenchantment and the anger and the frustration is just, I'm no spring chicken, but sometimes I think, am I going to be doing this for another 40 years? Just banging my head against the wall. And it's just sometimes such a frustrating experience.
Yeah. But the good news is that slowly they're taking the people who have been right over time and promoting them to positions of influence. For example, Jeffrey Goldberg is now editor of The Atlantic.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely somebody who's been right about so many things.
Virtually everything. I mean, that Saddam Al-Qaeda connection.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
He got it. He got it right.
Yeah. So I don't know, but we're not bitter. I think we should be. This should be like like the BBC's Happy Pod that they publish on
has a happy
Saturdays.
pod?
The BBC has a happy. If you subscribe to their like World Report podcast, which is actually not bad as MSM stuff goes, a couple updates a day. On the weekend they have the Happy Pod where they have good news, and I think that should be our vibe.
Wasn't happiness studies just proven bullshit though? Like I love how all of these like nudge things and happiness studies, aren't they all based on fraud? I mean, Bob, you not started, but I first became familiar with you through evolutionary psychology. But like, isn't a lot of this stuff now like under serious serious duress, to say the least, the last 20, 30 years of psychological study?
I wouldn't say evolutionary psychology is. I mean, in general, there's been a replication crisis, and I don't doubt that. Studies I cited in my book on evolutionary psychology haven't panned out. That's been a problem in psychology generally, including some of the happiness stuff, which generally has come under the rubric of positive psychology. Some of that, yeah. But again, that's not the kind of thing we bring up on our Happy Pod. Yeah, that's kind of a downer, Danny.
Sorry about that. The Happy Pod
on,
supports happiness studies.
You're harshing the vibe.
So I don't know what where are we on foreign policy? So I mean, speaking of what we were just talking about,
I just saw this week we're building the border wall again. So like
I saw that this morning.
Literally nothing has changed. We're building the border wall. We got to keep the bad people out, and we're carving through. I think they had to waive 26 federal laws, probably most of them environmental, so that they could build this incredibly destructive wall that goes through habitats, it goes through water tables. It's just the worst thing for the local environment there. But we're doing it again, so good for us.
I just saw that and was kind of shocked. I guess Biden is feeling the heat on this issue, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yes. And I don't know why, because it's never going to pay off for him. No matter how he can build a wall that's like 3 walls deep all across the border, and he's still never going to get any credit for the people he's trying to appease.
Yeah, I don't think between now and an election contest with Trump, he can sell the narrative that the wall was actually his idea. I don't think he can turn the conventional wisdom around that fast. So
then this leads to why the hell is he doing something like this? Which again leads into this larger question that we're talking about, which is this whole foreign policy thing. Like it's so obviously not in his political benefit. It's not going to make any real change on the ground, even for the reactionary policy that it's supposed to promote. And it's going to concomitantly destroy the environment. So it's when you constantly see decisions like this, it's just, what world are we actually living in?
I think they are freaking out about the rate of inflow. I mean, that's all I can. But I just don't. It's surprising if he's thinking ahead to the general election. That's a little surprising, because I would think he's still a little nervous about being dethroned as a Democratic candidate at the last minute, which wouldn't necessarily bother me, depending on who the replacement was.
I mean, it doesn't sound like it would bother anybody, but that would be so. I mean, it's just such a long shot for a sitting president to not get the nomination. I can't conceive of a scenario where that would happen.
No, unless he dies, which could happen.
Well,
but then he doesn't have to worry about it.
But then, he's not being unseated so much as
laid to rest. I think we can agree that if he dies, he will not be the candidate.
I don't know. I hear Feinstein's running again.
There were a number of variations on that joke. I don't know. And I guess you're right. He probably can't be unseated. But hope springs eternal. I really worry about a him versus Trump match. I mean, like, what's Stephen, from a foreign policy point of view, what is to really root for there, right? I mean, none of us likes Biden's foreign policy, and maybe we should talk a little bit about why. And, sometimes people say to me, well, then, if you're a restrainer, if you're against all this militarism, well, aren't you pretty happy with the Republican right wing, kind of the Matt Gaetz, Donald Trump version of this? I mean, those guys
they all want to invade Mexico.
I was just going to say that exact same thing.
Yeah.
I mean, these guys are crazy. I mean, he assassinated Soleimani, almost got us into war with Iran. I mean, these guys are as hypocritical and dishonest as Biden's purported enforcement of the quote rules-based order has been, given how often we ourselves have violated it. I mean, Trump is a complete outlaw. I mean, he'll do anything. So
Well,
I don't know.
I mean, most of these guys, and I don't know, maybe there's exceptions. I try not to pay that much attention to them, but it seems like for most of these people, wherever they want to restrain, wherever they want to pull back, it's so that they can take whatever resources have been pulled back and put them into starting World War III with China. Like I don't see the real restraint here from any of these guys.
No, that's the other weird thing. In fact, it was the Trumpists who almost started the pivot toward Cold War with China. Early in the COVID thing, Steve Bannon started going berserk on China. And I mean, it's not surprising given COVID started in China, questions about Wuhan, blah, 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 that you'd get, a little tension, but they really amped it up. And that was the beginning of what has since become an almost consensus support for the Cold. I don't know how you guys read it.
Yeah, I think Trump was a clarifying period for a lot of people in U.S. foreign policy, which it had, I think, a very incoherent, maybe, approach to China, kind of thrown together, where we're engaging on the one hand, but also they're a rival, and we're militarizing Taiwan, and we're worried about this, but we don't want to go too far. And it was like straddling the fence, I think, and Trump came down off of the fence. And I think for a lot of people who were still kind of wobbling between those two approaches, the fact that Trump decisively said these guys are the enemy was clarifying. It helped them kind of coalesce around that as the policy.
And this is actually, to me, pretty interesting when we're talking about the restrainer community, because this is the major fault line within this restrainer community. I think restraint as a policy in its modern form emerges from basically don't fight wars in the Middle East. And there's a lot of coalitions that could come together around that, whether you're a realist because you don't think it's that important, whether you're a leftist because you don't like imperialism. And I think that in the next few years, we're going to see the strength of this coalition, whether it could actually come together, because quite a few restrainers, most famously John Mersheimer, of course, they really want to confront China. I mean, they have a very aggressive policy toward China, which essentially, as more of a left winger, to me, just looks like imperialism by another name. And so I think this is why the China issue is important for a number of reasons, both in sort of the day-to-day policy that we're talking about. Will it invade Taiwan? What will happen then? But also, what does this mean for the coalitional politics of basically critics of U.S. foreign policy in the United States? And Bob, I'm curious what you think about that, who's someone who's a bit more connected to the Beltway than either me or Derek.
I think it's been a while since I was very connected to the Beltway. I once was at a think tank.
Flight magazine of Air Force One.
Yeah, well, the New Republic days too. Yes, you're right. I'm a total insider. I mean, there's that. I mean, I think there's two interesting splits, kind of. There's the one you referred to within kind of the realist community, although I think Mearsheimer doesn't have a lot of company. Certainly, if you look at the intensity of his China hawkism, I don't think he has a lot of company in the realist community. His former co-author, Steve Walt, I don't think would go nearly as far as John is going.
Walt is softer on it, but there's definitely you can't really kind of dominate there in the realist community. There's a softer.
There is that. Yeah. I was going to say the second split is among restrainers within the progressive community. Between, on the one hand, how they look at the Middle East, and on the other hand, how they look at Ukraine. Matt Duss is a good example. I really might like Matt, respect him. But on the Middle East, he's totally solid as far as I'm concerned. He's a little more hawkish than me when it comes to Ukraine, and that's not an uncommon thing. Like,
why do you think that is? So not to talk about Duss specifically, and if anyone's interested, I wrote something for the Quincy Institute where I ran through Matt's arguments in favor of Ukraine and argued about, against them. But what do you think that is? Because to me, it's such an obvious case. If the U.S. empire is going to ship arms around the world forever, then you're not going to get rid of the empire. You can't use it for good and then not expect it to be for bad. It's very simple, actually. As history has proven time and time again. So I don't quite understand the left hawkishness there.
I mean, I can see a case for being a little, there's a little tension within me, and I'll explain that. Let me first say, I think actually probably a better example than Matt is Joe Cirincione, who just went, he's like calling people
he cut the coalition.
Putin apologists. He's just like, he just left the team. Matt hasn't done that. But I think here's the tension I feel, which is, well, let me back up. I think with a lot of them, they have to some extent bought into the democracy versus autocracy framing narrative that the Biden administration is pushing, which I think is like the worst idea of my lifetime, almost. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The fact is that China did not set out to turn the world into a bunch of autocracies. It just doesn't want us to tell it not to be one. Okay.
It's also so ridiculous because if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, it wasn't related to politics literally at all.
No,
like they just aid whoever for whatever reason. It's total ignorance.
It's like us using the World Bank as an instrument of influence. It's a rival to the World Bank from their point of view, and meanwhile they'd like to gain influence within the World Bank and so on. It's just. It's not that
only we can do that. Only we could use international institutions.
Well, that's of course that's the story of our foreign policy. We continue to demand to be treated like the world's only hegemon when that just isn't going to stay true forever. China's pretty powerful. Russia's kind of powerful. They've got nuclear weapons. You have to pay attention to what they want a little. I was going to say, so I think there's that, and it's funny. I had a conversation with Matt Duss a couple years ago. We were taking a walk at a conference, and I said it was during the presidential campaign, so it must have been whenever that was. But he was on Bernie Sanders' staff at that point. He was his foreign policy advisor. And I said, I'm a little worried by how much emphasis you guys are putting on like our mission of wiping out authoritarianism around the world. How much Bernie is talking that talk, because I think that gets us into trouble. And it's a perfectly worthwhile aspiration to reduce the amount of authoritarianism and autocracy in the world. But I think to make it some kind of defining issue, foreign policy sounds a little neoconish. And he was like, no problem. Don't worry. But I think there is a little of that dividing progressives on Ukraine. Now, my own source of tension is about international law, look, Russia did invade. That's a violation of international law. That's a bad thing. It's just that I would be more up for, risking World War III to punish them if it weren't the case that our own violations of the exact same international law had so degraded the norm of complying with the law that you're not getting much real benefit from enforcing it at this point until we start complying with it. That's my thing, and I've talked a long time, so you guys should take
of course. And I've been thinking a lot about international law recently as well. I think this might be a case of we have to come up with an entirely new system at this point. I think that the system that was created in the 40s has just been so delegitimized over the last 75 years, and you need some sort of public buy-in for law to work. That needs some sort of legitimating force, and I think that could actually be something useful that the United States and China could work toward. But there's clearly zero interest in that in the United States. So it seems like international law at this point is a chimera, except for some global South nations at some moments when people decide to pay attention.
There was a moment of hope that you're too young to remember, but right after the Cold War ended, oddly, the first Bush administration actually seemed to be taking international law kind of seriously. I mean, the Persian Gulf War, it was in response to a violation of international law. Bush went through the Security Council. So the Persian Gulf War was a totally legal thing, justified by the UN Charter. And he was, then things started going haywire, I would say, in the Clinton administration. Kosovo was pretty clearly an illegal intervention. Not the Bosnian intervention. That went through the Security Council. Kosovo, illegal, and then you get, with Bush, you get just Iraq and so on, and it all falls apart. I think there was a moment after the Cold War when the U.S. could have exerted huge influence on these norms.
Bob, I have a question, and if we're talking this counterfactual, because I do think it's really important. Do you think there could be a genuine international law with a hegemon? Because to me, those seem to be almost contradictory.
It would have to be a very wise and self-aware hegemon that understood that it was in its own interest, especially as its relative power was inevitably declining, that it was in its own interest to establish a world characterized by the rule of law. Could have happened. Clinton talked the talk. He supposedly understood that our power was declining, but he didn't, walk the walk. He also set NATO expansion into motion, which I think.
And he gives up on defense. I'm reading a great paper by Mike Brennis. He gave up on defense conversion very quickly. By 93, 94, once the economy starts to look a little better, he's like, okay, we don't need to do defense conversion any longer. So, I mean, maybe there's like a 2 or 3 year period. But then this leads, just as a historian, if you're looking at this concept, if it's such a small window, it might suggest to me basically the fundamental tension between hegemony and law, right? Like the Schmittian tension of who's the decision maker. Right. Basically, every American just says that the United States decides the state of exception, and it obviously arrogates to itself when it makes that decision. So it leaves a very difficult position for promoters of international law and promoters of liberalism, I would say, generally at the international level. Liberalism itself has not functioned well at the level of the globe.
Derek, do you have anything to say about this? I have a little bit.
I'm sympathetic with you, Bob, because I think we'd all be much better off if there was actually a rules-based international order. But there isn't one, and I don't see the possibility for one. I mean, the United States, just at a very fundamental level, you have a country that has a law in its books that it will invade The Hague if one of its service members is picked up for war crimes. That's just that's just a small thing, but it's such a stark example of the United States just saying this doesn't apply to us. We talk about it, and Bill Clinton talked a good game. Barack Obama talked a good game. They always talk a good game. Biden talks a good game, but we are just in our bones committed to the idea that none of this stuff that we talk about actually applies to us. We're the exception.
That is a drawback of my dream world. But we all agree that things can't be great in the world until there's some kind of fundamental revision in American foreign policy, right? Like, what's the more realistic one? What's your scenario? Like Trump gets elected and then somebody lobotomizes him or something? What?
I think it's lost.
I don't have a good scenario. I mean, this is where you can help us with the happy time hour, Bob, because we're not happy.
Yeah, we basically think we lost. I
think we lost. I think that we're on a clock now before climate change really wrecks everything, and I don't see a way to get past this hegemonic impulse to a place of real international law and real international cooperation in time to address what's coming.
I mean, I could be a little hopeful. Okay, let's be a little hopeful. I think that there is a particular state formation that has developed in the United States that is extraordinarily anti-democratic. If we make the state a little bit more anti-democratic, I do think that Americans' impulses, once like the war fever of something stops, is generally towards non-intervention and non-adventurism. I think that's a long-standing American tradition going back to the Foreign Entanglements farewell address of George Washington. So I do think if we do want to have this sort of less hegemonic impulse, it has to start at home, basically. I think that would be the site of action, which is kind of ironic because leftists are traditionally internationalist. But I would say this 20th and 21st century have just demonstrated, for whatever either structural or contingent reasons, that left internationalism was never an especially viable project when it came to taming international relations or ending war. So I would say the site is really domestic and really in state reform and democratization of the American state.
Yeah, but see, I don't think even extreme skepticism about military intervention is enough. I mean, my reading on the direction of technological evolution is that we're going to have to get very serious about global governance. Not just because of climate change. I thought that was the worst problem we face. I actually think biotech and even AI are things it's more important. I mean, things that in principle pose a nearer term risk of like radical destabilization of the world and even death and suffering. And so I'm just not, that's another reason that the Trumpist vision just isn't enough for me. These guys are anti-global governance. They are national sovereignty obsessives and don't understand that to really, in a certain sense, to preserve sovereignty in the sense of America exerting control over its own fate, you have to sacrifice certain kinds of sovereignty and enter into some of these international treaties and so on. So I worry that's
but then to me, this goes to the heart of what it means to be an American. So I would say since the 1960s, at least, consumption has been the basic form of legitimacy for American politics. It's how much one is able to consume. And the consumption relies on the United States being at the top of the global supply chain, and the global capitalist consumption chain. I mean, you guys might know the exact statistic, but what is the percentage of energy Americans use? They're 4% of the population. They use 20% or 25% of all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, that is like the fundamental brick wall, is that you have a political system whose legitimacy relies on excessive consumption, and that consumption relies on American hegemony. So that's one brick wall. And then the other problem is that other nations, particularly China and India, are also organizing their politics around consumptive practices. And if they consume like Americans, there's no hope, which again, always, and I won't go into it, but this then brings us to the problem of capitalism itself.
I knew we'd get there.
Bob, can you talk a little bit more about your concerns with AI? Because this isn't something that Danny and I have talked about on our show, but I'm interested in hearing about it from somebody who is not a Silicon Valley tech bro, humble bragging about how the code that he just wrote could destroy the world, which I think is just a sales pitch, basically. But I'm interested in what your concerns are.
Yeah, mine isn't really. I'm agnostic on that nightmare scenario. Like, will it turn into this super intelligence that will almost choose to subjugate us? And I don't know, maybe eventually. I'm more worried about near-term destabilization along a number of fronts. It's just going to happen very fast. Just take employment alone, okay? It is going to displace people from their jobs. Now, the standard reaction of kind of techno-optimists and a number of economists as well in the long run, often, typically tech revolutions create more jobs than they destroy. Well, first of all, there are dissents on that. Not all economists believe that. But even if that's the case, like even if all these people are displaced and they eventually find another job, that is disorienting and destabilizing. It's not fun to lose your job. And if that happens fast enough, that's an issue. And then I could list a number of other dimensions along which I think there's going to be rapid change. I mean, for example, this is in a way continuation of the social media revolution with the downsides that apparently had so far as kind of tribalization, polarization. I think this extends that. This is famously something that, quote, bad actors can put to use to turn out the lights all over the planet. I think all these things are soluble in the long run, but I think dealing with them is often going to call for forms of international governance that are nowhere near being in place. That's going to take time. And B, even if it were at the national policy making level, well, our national governance is a complete shambles. You can't expect intelligent policy to emerge, especially in a near-term time frame. So,
Bob, I have a quick question. So, like when we talk about automation and stuff like that, the difference between what's coming in the next few years with AI is it's really going to affect middle and upper middle class professionals. It's going to be much easier to ask AI to write a contract than it is to pay a lawyer.
This was my question
Right.
too.
Yeah. So
Right.
like, how does that affect it? Because what happened in the 80s, the 70s, 80s, and 90s with deindustrialization broadly in the Rust Belt, but also, you know, the automation of things like logging, is that it destroyed the blue collar classes, and now the working classes.
It wrecked relatively politically powerless classes, and I wonder. I think this is where you're going, Danny. As you get as we start to automate things that like people who give money to candidates or give money to parties and have political influence, could it broaden the case for something like universal basic income or some way to ameliorate?
I think there will be new coalitions, and it's hard to predict. I mean, I think the people who have enough money to donate a lot to candidates are probably going to get through this okay. But for a while, but look, it's moving up the food chain, and it's going to move pretty fast. And so I think it's unpredictable, and maybe some good will come out of some of the new coalitions that form. But I just look, I'm a worrier. Maybe I'm wrong about all this.
This raises interesting questions about the future of work itself and sort of the getting rid of was it David Graeber, the bullshit jobs thing, which is basically the professional managerial class, you know, the proverbial email job. What does this mean when work itself, as traditionally imagined in the United States, goes away? Obviously, there's the Marxist hope, you know, fishing in the morning, criticizing in the afternoon, etc. But like, we don't seem to have any social context for imagining that, let alone a culture that would promote sort of human flourishing, as opposed to
we don't have a society. I mean, Bob talked about social media. Like, nobody does anything with anybody anymore. It's so atomized. Everybody's so kind of on their own.
AI could make it much worse.
Yeah.
I mean, the metaverse, I don't think Zuckerberg's wrong about the metaverse. I just think he's wrong about the time frame and the point of entry he chose to try to exploit it. I mean, just by the way, I should consult with you on what we do here. So our plan is, and this is, of course, Danny disapproves of this because this is a capitalist plot in itself. Our plan for revenue generation, what we had thought we would do with these podcasts generally is, you know, have a decent length conversation that's public. And then at some point, paywall comes down. Just because a person's got to make a living. Even Danny might, in some sense. I see he's muted his mic.
What? Capitalists. Socialists make the best capitalists.
Oh, always. Good. Well, then I'm glad we got you.
For what it is.
That's why we got you on our team, Danny, for marketing advice. So anyway, this is going to be on both of our podcast feeds, American Prestige and Nonzero, and the paywall is going to descend at some point in these conversations. And I guess since I guess this one is going to descend before long in this podcast, but before that happens, we should say that so if you subscribe to either Nonzero newsletter, or I mean, if you're a paid subscriber to Nonzero newsletter, or you're a paid subscriber to American Prestige, you get this. But we're going to try to work out some kind of joint. You tell me, Derek, what's our plan? Some kind of money saving thing?
Andrew and I have talked about this. You get 20% off your first year subscription to the other show. So if you're a subscriber to Nonzero and you want to subscribe to American Prestige, you get 20% off a year, and vice versa. We have special links for this, which you can do in Substack, discount links that'll be in the show description, but they'll be after the paywall. So, you know, you gotta be subscribed to one of us to get the link to the other.
Okay, that's the way it works. So there will be links in the show notes to this podcast, but to get the link, you have to first subscribe to one of us, and then you'll find the link to the 20% discount for the other. Is that it?
For the other one, that's it.
Got it. That's genius. So glad you guys are part of this marketing.
That's right. We're scheming away.
Is this the future of media? It is going to be the New York Times and 50 million independent things, basically. That's
Yeah.
what we're leaning towards.
I mean, it's
That's where
crazy.
we're
Like it's.
I heard, isn't like someone's ratings? Is it CNN's ratings are down like to a third of what they were over Trump? Like
Yeah.
it just seems like this is the end. You know, Trump was that dead cat bounce, and now we're heading into.
Well, but I mean, he's going to be back. He's going to be back for the next year. They're going to have all the
but
campaign
reboots are
high
never
again.
as good. Reboots are never good.
I know. But you can certainly, I mean, you can see why. You know, they have all these people on, you know, CNN and MSNBC, whatever, to talk about how awful Trump is. But man, they cover the shit out of him because he's good for ratings. A lot of free media for that guy.
So is the paywall descending now? Should we say thank you to all who and even if you don't sign up and give us your hard-earned money, we love you.
Thanks for giving us your time.
Thanks for giving us your time. However, I'm not going to lie, we'd love you a whole lot more.
The money would be better. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we're headed into overtime, and thanks to everybody. And here we go.